This is the picture, I think, that has come to symbolize this whole fiasco. This photo, I think, represents better than maybe anything else what happened in Wisconsin last week. There's a voter in Milwaukee noting that this was ridiculous. As many of you surely remember, what happened in Milwaukee in particular was that there were only 5 voting stations out of 180 that were open for people to vote because, of course, the difficulty of rounding up people to actually staff all of these voting stations, leading to long lines for people who wanted to turn up to vote. But what is really going on in this picture, I think, in this photo, is being driven because of the partisan wrangling associated with how to handle voter access. So what does all of this have to do with November's presidential election coming up on November 3rd? Well, this partisan wrangling between the Democrats and the Republicans over how to handle voter access, ease of voting, the prevalence of mail-in voting, what IDs should be required to be allowed to turn up in person to vote, all of this kind of stuff has been raging for years between the two political parties. What all of this is really about, and has been for years, is the ongoing war between the Democrats and the Republicans over how easy to make access to the vote, especially during a pandemic. President Trump has even weighed in on this recently with this tweet on ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is a particular kind of voter fraud. It's not about when an individual turns up to vote illegally. Ballot harvesting is the concern that somebody might be collecting a whole bunch of mail-in ballots or a whole bunch of absentee ballots, let's say, for example, from an assisted living facility, and fill them in themselves or in some way manipulate them. That is what President Trump is talking about in that tweet. But this also ties into allegations that he has been making for years of concern over widespread voter fraud. But to talk about mail-in balloting in particular, on one level, it is fair to say that mail-in voting is more challenging to pull off in a secure fashion. On the contrary, we have 5 states right now that vote pretty much uniformly through mail-in balloting, and these states do not report widespread problems. Ballot harvesting is something that happens. Probably the most high-profile recent example of this surely was in North Carolina in 2018, when a congressional election had to be run again the following year after evidence surfaced that a Republican political operative had been collecting ballots surreptitiously to help the candidate that he supported. But again, it's not really a widespread problem. And as I've already mentioned, states that do mail-in balloting far more frequently and regularly have developed good mechanisms for reducing or even eliminating these kinds of problems. Another thing I think is important to mention here is that when the two political parties or members of those political parties talk about concerns over voting, they're also very likely being self-interested. Democrats think that easier access to the ballot helps them. Republicans think that easier access to the ballot hurts them. President Trump has even said this. So all of this is also kind of mired in the self-interest of the two political parties. My take on it is that I don't really care about their particular self-interest. And here's why. I think that the answer to these questions about whether to make voting access easier or harder, especially during a pandemic, is that we should make it easy. We are supposed to be a representative democracy after all. And what we know is this: there is a lot of evidence that in-person voter fraud, an individual showing up at the ballot to vote illegally, is a vanishingly rare problem. I would never say that it never happens, but it does not happen in any kind of substantial numbers. Things like ballot harvesting are a different concern for states that are thinking about moving towards a more substantial mail-in voting system during this current pandemic. Again, those elections can be more challenging to pull off securely, but the states that do this, including Oregon, including Utah, have shown that with thoughtful planning and preparation, those problems can be overcome. So my take on this is that states should be seriously considering doing what they can to make voting in November both safer and more accessible. And ideally, they would get some backup and resources from Congress for this. Congress is not going to provide this backup and these resources, but in an ideal world, we would be planning for this November election better than we probably are in order to prevent things like what happened in North Carolina with that ballot harvesting example in 2018, but also to prevent people like this voter having to show up in person when doing so might put their health at risk.